what you heard earlier, this will be a process for many of our awardees who have some of the strongest proposals we've ever supported. They haven't been funded until they've been through the cycle, maybe 3, maybe 4 times. So just keep in mind that this is kind of a long game. Could be a long game, or you could be very successful at the outset. But our goal today is to provide you with as much information as possible, so that you kind of hit the ground running with a strong proposal at the outset. So first, let me just mention the overall goals for the NRT program. The first is to advance cutting-edge convergent research in high priority areas. So I'll talk a little bit about convergence and a little bit about what we mean by high priority areas. But basically, when we talk about convergence research, we're talking about high degrees of interdisciplinarity, so much so that even the disciplinary boundaries, what we would call the epistemological boundaries between how these different sciences conceive of themselves in terms of methodologies, in terms of traditions, start to come together, start to merge a little bit, and perhaps what comes out of that might even be a new discipline. But also, when we talk about convergence, we're talking about converging on a problem. So it's only through the combination, the interaction of these disciplines that we can begin to solve some of the challenges, the grand challenges, the thorny problems, often societal problems that we're seeking to address. So it has both that impact element of societal problem, and it also has that fusion of disciplines. Next is to produce diverse cohorts of interdisciplinary STEM professionals with technical and transferable professional skills for careers within and outside academia. So we talk about inclusive workforce development, and here we really mean inclusive in 2 senses. So one is inclusive of the diversity of the population, of the domestic population in the United States, and with particular attention to students from populations that are underrepresented in graduate education and in the STEM workforce. But we're also talking about being inclusive of the breadth of career pathways that graduate students in STEM seek to pursue and often end up pursuing successfully. So we're trying to sort of move the needle, particularly in terms of how we prepare doctoral students, but also master's and doctoral overall, in terms of preparing them not just for academic career paths, but for the breadth of career paths. And then third here is to develop innovative approaches and knowledge that will promote transformative improvements in graduate education. And I'll talk about sort of what we would look at to see whether there are indicators that this will be transformative in graduate education. But we're looking at transformations not just within the participating programs that are coming together, but also within the institution more broadly, and then across fields most broadly. So the NRT program is a cross-directorate program. So we work with every science directorate at NSF, and every NRT represents an average of 3 NSF science directorates. We co-manage the program with program officers, program directors from across the NSF Science Directorate. So it's really it's a stronger together collaboration between the Directorate for STEM Education and each of the science directorates mentioned here. And we're very excited to be embarking on some new collaborations with the new TIP Directorate, which is Technologies, Innovation, and Partnership. The pie chart here shows you the overall picture of the distribution of awarded NSF NRT projects. The only thing that I would say about this is that the harnessing the data revolution looks slightly overrepresented, because when the NRT began, that was really the only field in which we started to fund projects. So this isn't to suggest where you would most likely receive funding. What are your chances? This just represents the whole pie from 2014 until last year. And as you can see to the right, all of these acronyms, these abbreviations refer to what NSF calls the 10 big ideas. So we have harnessing the data revolution, data-enabled science and engineering, a lot of data-focused projects, navigating the new Arctic. There's a new emphasis on quantum information science and engineering, as well as a strong recent emphasis on artificial intelligence. And then you can see other themes like the future of work at the human technology frontier. So this is the big ideas framework. We're not quite sure how staunchly we'll be wedded to this framework as we go on. But the point that I want to make is that we really encourage proposals across any high priority research theme that you can make the case that this should be a high national priority. So if you can demonstrate that case in the proposal, whether or not we call it out in the solicitation, we welcome those proposals. So now a little information about the awards. So we've, since 2014, had $3 million awards for up to 5 years. These awards were and continue to be open to both Research One and non-Research One Carnegie classified very high and high research activity institutions. The one thing I would say is, yes, it's been $3 million since 2014, and that's problematic. That means we're asking institutions to do more and more with dollars that just don't go as far. So that amount is something we'd like to look at, and but we're also committed to the diversity of the portfolio and to funding more institutions. To that end, we've also introduced a track 2, which is awards of $2 million. And these awards are limited to non-Research One institutions. The goal here is to create a stronger competitiveness pathway for non-Research One institutions that may not have the ability to shape projects at the scope and scale of a track 1 award. And although I'm not allowed to talk about specific award rates, I can generally say that the track 2 path is less competitive. In other words, there's a higher chance of institutions receiving funding under track 2 at this moment. Now, we don't know what will happen going forward, but at this time that they have a higher competitive rate. So the next thing I would say is that the institution receives the award. So the institution receives the award of $3 million or $2 million if it's track 2. Within those awards, trainees are funded for a minimum of 12 months for $34,000. Now there's some movement in that area from $34,000 to $37,000. The NRT will be tied to the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, and so when that movement happens, we will roll out the appropriate adjustment for the trainee stipends. This used to be 12 months consecutive funding, and that's no longer 12 months consecutive funding. So one of the nice things about that, releasing that stricture, is that institutions may have a little more flexibility if $34,000 in one consecutive year could put sort of introduce a level of inequity between their funded trainees and their non-funded trainees. Every NRT does have both funded and non-funded trainees, and we try not to provide data on how many trainees on average are track 1 and track 2. We don't quite know track 2 yet because we have such a small sample. But with respect to track 1, I would say roughly the ballpark is between, say, 18 and 28 trainees per track 1. So something around 25, but we're not trying to be prescriptive, and it really depends on how you shaped your project. The next deadline for the NRT program is September 6th, and it's going to be about this time in an ongoing fashion. So it's once a year. We have an annual deadline of September 6th. And that should give you quite a bit of time to shape a team and to shape a proposal. And at any point, and I'll emphasize this, and my colleagues will emphasize this, but at any point, if you have a concept paper that you're ready to share with program officers, we are very happy to review that concept paper and start that conversation with you. So the bottom of this slide is the program solicitation, link to the program solicitation. And everything that I cite here in terms of tips, you'll hear deeper tips, I think, from some of our colleagues, but everything that I share here is coming right from the program solicitation. Okay, oh, going backwards. Okay, so as I mentioned, every funded NRT has an average of 3 directorates, STEM directorates represented. And what I'm sorry, EHR should now be updated to EDU. Our directorate has changed its name from Education and Human Resources, which often received calls about how do we get jobs, where do we get jobs at NSF, to EDU, which is the Directorate for STEM Education. But we cut across, this directorate cuts across every NRT. In presenting on the NRT in the sort of broadest vision and how we align with the future direction of STEM education for the 21st century, in the past I've cited a National Academies report called Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century. And it's really quite revealing when we look across all of the recommendations from this report for what STEM education should look like, how many of these are actually reflected in the NRT program and in the NRT projects that we fund. So I won't read each of these bullets, but just to note that comb-shaped researchers, which is to say, and I'll show you both breadth and depth, the depth of a research degree and the breadth of professional skills and interdisciplinary training, the student-centered and focused professional development, the information about career paths, in-depth mentoring, all of these are aspects of the NRT. So I mentioned the comb-shaped model. You probably have heard of a T-shaped person or the T-shaped graduate student who has the depth of their graduate research training, as well as the breadth of skills that would allow them to be highly attractive on a non-academic job market. What we find the NRTs tend to shape are comb-shaped graduate students, which is to say they have multiple areas of domain expertise, multiple areas of in-depth technical skills and research skills, but they also have this breadth of professional development, whether it's in communication skills, ethics, recognition of ethics in multiple employment contexts of the work that they're doing, the research that they're doing, or team science and teamwork, that they're able to come out with their degrees and be very viable candidates, but also very successful researchers in multiple contexts. So next is just the key elements overall of a successful NRT program. So the interdisciplinary or convergence that I mentioned is really relevant both to the research as well as to the training in every NRT, and you'll hear some examples today. But also we require professional development in 3 areas and encourage it in additional areas that are tailored to the themes and the projects that you might be proposing. So we require every trainee and every NRT to address communication skills. Also to address, we've newly added teamwork or team science skills and ethical skills, ethical deliberation, research ethics. And the points that I want to make about these requirements is that we're not looking typically, or reviewers are not looking for checkboxes. So you might say, well, okay, we'll just do responsible conduct of research and have students go online and do a basic responsible conduct of research training. Well, a lot of graduate schools on disciplines, it's mandatory for students. So we're not looking to think, what would ethics mean in the context of the research theme that you're proposing students to work on? If it's artificial intelligence, maybe bias in artificial intelligence introduces ethical concerns. If it's environmental mitigation, if it's climate mitigation issues, maybe working with the communities that are disproportionately impacted by the climate issues that are arising and figuring out how do researchers best work with those communities, raise macroethical or community ethical concerns that could be woven into the project. So just think about what should team science mean in the context of your project? What might communications to professional development mean in the context of your project? Okay. And then all of this is sort of measured. The success of every NRT is really measured in across two metrics, fundamental metrics, and one is institutional transformation. So NSF is not simply looking to fund 5-year projects that will be viable for 5 years and then sunset after the expiration of the funding. Now you may find that you need to sunset some of the elements that weren't successful, but you really want to be thinking from the very outset of the shaping of the proposal. Who do we need to be in dialogue with at our institution to make sure that we're demonstrating that there's potential for sustainability of the successful elements of this program? What external partners might we have who can help us demonstrate that sustainability? And also think, how can we use our evaluation team to help us demonstrate what is successful, what's not successful, and perhaps an advisory board that might help us think about sustainability strategies. So as these proposals are being reviewed, reviewers are already looking at, is there a plan for the work to continue after the expiration of the grant funding? And then the next point is, as I mentioned earlier, inclusive workforce development. So we're really looking at, are these projects preparing trainees for the breadth of careers relevant to these research themes, and are these projects including the diverse populations that we're seeking to bring into STEM and that we're seeking to send out into really exciting, vibrant careers, rewarding careers, working on these research themes. So speaking of research themes, so here you can see the current priority themes, priority areas in the solicitation for the NRT. Artificial intelligence, QISE, harnessing the data revolution, future of work at the human technology frontier, windows on the universe, navigating the new Arctic, and understanding the rules of life. So for any of these, we direct you to NSF's discussion of the 10 big ideas to get a little more sense of, is the theme that you're considering, does it intersect with one of these themes? If there's an imperfect match, don't worry about it. We'll address that in the review process, and a perfect match doesn't necessarily need to be had to fund a project that would come in under any of these themes. But again, I'll just emphasize that we are open to any themes of national importance, and you could use federal, OSTP presidential reports on STEM priorities, as well as NSF documents about STEM priorities to demonstrate that. So since 2014, when the NRT began, we funded 148 projects, and these have been awarded to 105 institutions in 43 states and Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We're seeking to fund all 50 states, but we're also seeking to bump that number of institutions from 105 institutions up. We're looking to fund more institutions and a more diverse cadre of institutions. And with that in mind, we particularly want to fund and support more strong proposals from MSIs, from HBCUs, from non-research one institutions. And so we're very happy to work with you and help inspire that iterative process. Here, there's a link for currently funded NRT projects, and of course, you might want to get a flavor of what has been funded, particularly in whatever research areas that you're thinking of proposing. So go and take a look at the abstracts and see what has been proposed already. And then you might see, well, do they have an external website? Most of these projects, especially the newer ones, have an external website. You can go deeper into those projects. I'll show you a new NRT website where you can see interviews with PIs. You can see highlights of what some of the trainees have done with their traineeships and their degrees. So try to get a flavor of what these NRTs are beyond the solicitation as you're thinking of what you might be proposing, just to make sure that you're not proposing something that's already been funded. So this is the website I mentioned. This just came live in the last year, and we're very happy with breaking out of the typical mode of as Giselle and perhaps my colleague Charisse will know, the typical NSF website for programs has been quite dry, quite devoid of images and highlights of individuals and individual success stories. And NSF, to its credit, is moving in the direction of dialogue, of community engagement, and most importantly to me, of highlighting impact. So what we're trying to do with this NRT website is to really demonstrate the impact that these projects are having in an ongoing kind of real-time way. So encourage you to explore that resource. So you'll hear from a very successful NRT later this morning. What I will just highlight are a few, and these just happen to be 3 climate related NRTs, and it's not to say that there's an overemphasis on climate right now, but I will just note that regardless of those buckets of priority themes that I showed earlier, there are a good number that are intersecting with issues of climate, issues of equity, issues of bias. So there are themes that aren't necessarily the big ideas research themes, but they're more societal themes that are becoming prevalent. And we're just noticing these patterns in what's becoming what we're funding. So all of these have a climate or environmental connection. So this first one is from Boston University. The NRT name is BU Urban. And what they're doing is looking at things like greenhouse gas emissions, air and water pollution evaluation, and threats to human health from urban heat waves or other extreme weather events. They have really a really thoughtful set of internships and experiences with non-governmental, governmental organizations and the private sector. They also have had a really successful policy event where trainees would go and meet with people on the Hill to sort of talk about the work that they're doing. And that creates linkages between the NRT and policy makers, and sort of introduces to graduate students, how do you communicate differently maybe to a policymaker than you would to your fellow graduate students or to those in the community with whom you're working. So you can see this project combines 6 disciplines. These disciplines will all be represented on the core research teams that are, it's really the very first thing that appears in an NRT proposal is a chart with 10, up to 10 core research faculty members, no more than 10, but that will signal to the reviewers and to NSF that these are genuinely interdisciplinary convergent research projects, and that graduate students will have dialogue across these disciplines. And so I'll just leave this slide for you to explore later, but you can click on the link here and actually get a spotlight on an individual trainee talking about their work from each of these projects. The next project is from Auburn University, and this is on climate resilience. And similarly, this spans an array of sectors and disciplines, and uses different methodological approaches from those different disciplines to prepare students to work in interdisciplinary teams on the theme of climate resilience. And similarly, a combination of internships, experiential learning experiences, and you can see the extensive array of partnerships that the Auburn NRT has shaped in order to ensure that these experiences are informed by community interactions. And then finally, this is one that's currently highlighted, I think, on the NRT website, an interview with the principal investigator from this University of Arizona NRT, which is IndigiFuse, focusing on indigenous communities and in collaboration with the Navajo Nation and Navajo Technical University. And so if you're interested in sort of an interview with the PI and how do they describe what the NRT has enabled them to do in terms of collaborating with those in their community, this is a great example, and it is highlighted on the website. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, what would you need to know if you're going to shape a proposal about the review process, and what might be helpful to know in advance. So first thing I wanted to highlight was panel composition. So when you submit an NRT proposal to the NRT and we put it on a panel, these are not going to be just STEM researchers from the disciplines or the themes that are addressed in the proposal. We're also going to bring in maybe graduate deans who have expertise in how do you lead an interdisciplinary unit or project? How do you ensure success, feasibility, sustainability? We also bring together expert evaluators who will look at the evaluation plan and pick it apart. So you want to make sure that the team that you bring in to evaluate the NRT has a hand in the proposal writing from the beginning. You don't want to just shape the project and then hand it off to an evaluator and say, can you just write a paragraph? That will be very, very legible to the evaluators. So they want to see that there's been dialogue between the research team and the evaluation, and that you really threaded through that professional development plan, the training components, the research activities into the evaluation. And we also bring broadening participation experts. So you might say, well, you know, we're an HBCU, so of course we'll get credit for broadening, you know, having a strong broadening participation. But as many of you know, at the graduate level, some of these disciplines, your programs may not be that much more diverse than programs at other non-HBCU institutions. So no matter sort of where you're starting, you want to demonstrate what's our baseline, what's the demographic diversity where we're starting, and we ask you to provide that in the form of a data table. And then what is our strategy to get to where we're aspiring to go in terms of inclusiveness and broadening participation in these projects. So you'll hear more ideas about how to address those strategies, and you'll have great ideas yourself, I'm sure. We also bring NRT PIs, and I think probably more NRT PIs now than IGE PIs, but we do have active PIs who can really evaluate the NRT proposal as a whole. Is this missing some essential component that from their experience they've learned is really sort of a do or die for a successful NRT. So next, I'll just talk about the review criteria briefly, and I think we'll hear from other speakers really breaking apart these review criteria. So the first are the core NSF merit review criteria of intellectual merit and broader impact. But then we have 5 additional review criteria in the solicitation that speak to those elements that are the cornerstones of a successful NRT. And those include integration of research and education, interdisciplinarity and convergence, professional development, broadening participation strategy, or integration of diversity, and evaluation. And so for each of these criteria, in our guidelines to reviewers, we have questions. So these questions are prompts for reviewers to consider and ask themselves as they're reading your proposals, does this proposal successfully answer these questions? These questions are not coming out of the blue, and we're not making them up, you know, outside of the process. They're in the solicitation, but it's easy to miss some of these questions in the solicitation because it's very dense. There are a lot of requirements. You're going to be focused on, you know, checking all of the check boxes. So what I've done on these next few slides, and I won't read every question for each of these slides, you can review these on your own, but just broke each one down into a separate question that you really want to think about as you're developing these proposals. So with respect to intellectual merit and broader impacts, all of the questions here really apply both to intellectual merit and broader impact. And so those include things like, to what extent do the proposed activities suggest and explore creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts? So people will be reviewing a proposal saying, is this kind of the same old? And, you know, or is this university doing this practice actually going to create more dialogue? Is it going to create new innovative sparks across the graduate education system? Does the plan incorporate a mechanism to assess success? That's relevant both to broader impact and to intellectual merit. How well qualified is the individual, team, or organization to conduct the proposed activities? So you really want to include discussion of the qualifications of your team, who you brought together, why you brought this team together. And just one other word about intellectual merit and broader impact. It'd be easy to say, well, the NRTs focus on research and education. So the intellectual merit, we'll talk about the research, and broader impacts, we'll talk about the education or the societal impact. But we're really looking at the intellectual merit of the education plan as well. So the traineeship program is fair game in terms of intellectual merit, and particularly the integration of the research and the traineeship components. So you can see here some questions that you might ask and this might include a proposed activity to advance knowledge and understanding both within and across fields. What is the potential interdisciplinary areas? What's the potential to promote transformative improvements? Project addressing training needs, maybe workforce development needs that are not being commonly addressed across other graduate education programs. With respect to broader impacts, some of the questions that we're asking are, what is the potential benefit to society to advance desired societal outcomes? What is the potential to broaden participation for students from underrepresented groups? And what is the workforce development potential of these programs? Are you filling a workforce niche or need that isn't being otherwise fulfilled at your institution or in your region, or more broadly? So one of the most common weaknesses identified by NRT panels of proposals that might require some iteration is the integration of research and education. So when often in the first one or two cycles of a proposal, it might be very evident that the researchers came together and have a great idea for a interdisciplinary or convergence research theme. And then some people were assigned, okay, can you shape the educational plan around this? And the two teams really weren't talking to each other, and they weren't integrated. And so what you really want to see is the research themes are infused, are interwoven into every one of those educational components. And similarly, in the shaping of the research questions, even the research design, there should be some nod to, okay, how is that research design going to be reflected in the graduate student's thesis? How is it going to play out in an internship opportunity that they may have? And so you really want to demonstrate that integration of both research and education. Okay, so next is interdisciplinarity and convergence. So, occasionally NRT proposals will come in where it's really evident that it's one discipline, a strong emphasis on one discipline with a little bit of maybe applied artificial intelligence or a little applied machine learning. And it might look like it's really just adding a complementary cross-disciplinary training skill that's application. That occasionally those squeak through, but for the most part, review panels are quite critical if it looks like one of the disciplines is simply a kind of technical skill, is occasion for a technical skill rather than deep research dialogue between the disciplines. And what's the potential to catalyze convergence research in a high priority area? So is this something that NSF has been funding for decades? And there's already a strong body of research and perhaps even education on the theme proposed, or is what you're proposing something novel, something new, something that could be catalytic. Okay, and next is professional development. I already said, I think what I really want to get across on the theme of professional development, which is to make sure that these are not checked. We have some requirements of communication skills, ethics, team science, or teamwork. Make sure these don't just look like check boxes, but that there's some real thought about how these can add value to the traineeship. And one more point, and I think I might share this later, but you also want to demonstrate that the training plan for the trainees doesn't add time to degree significant burden on students in addition to the research requirements. So one way of doing that is to really sort of illustrate, here's a typical trainee, and here's how that typical trainee will go through this program in a way that is manageable and that's complementary to the research program rather than a kind of an additional burden on top of that research program. Is there anything else there? Let's see. Okay, and then with respect to integration of diversity, I already mentioned we require every PI to include a demographic table of all the participating graduate programs that will be represented in the NRT project. And what you want to show there is what is the percentage, what is the proportion of majority to underrepresented minority students, what is the gender breakdown, and we want to see, I think it's completion rates, time to degree, and refer to the solicitation about exactly how we ask for these data. I think in a future iteration, we want to be perhaps a little more prescriptive about what we're looking, because we're seeing little apples and oranges. But if you follow it very carefully, what we're asking for there, you'll have no problem. But more importantly, you'll have a very good sense of the baseline that you're starting from, and then be able to articulate the broadening participation strategy around that baseline. And then the quality of not just your recruiting plan, how do we get students to come into the program, but what's the mechanism for ensuring their support, their success, and their completion of the program. And then finally, evaluation. So does the evaluation plan include outcomes, performance measures, benchmarks, an evaluation timetable, and plans to use formative evaluation to improve practice? So here, I would just say, go to the language in the solicitation and really break apart what's required in the evaluation plan. Identify an evaluator early on. We used to require that all evaluators were external. There was an external evaluator. We now no longer require that, but you do want to make sure that it's clear how your evaluator will not be biased with respect to evaluating your program. And if you have questions about sort of budget for evaluation, I mean, I guess I would say don't hesitate to include that question in the conversation with PIs, because sometimes we get kind of late down the stage and there's just an enormous evaluation budget, and there may be some dialogue with PIs about justifying that, or about thinking, could some of this go to trainees? And so with respect to internal evaluators, you just want to make sure you have somebody who has experience and expertise in program evaluation. And as I mentioned earlier, make sure that the evaluator is a part of the conversation about how are we demonstrating the potential for this project to have sustainability. Okay, so I'll just show this and kind of brief. I think, do we have till 10:30 for including questions and answers? Or do we have a little time after? 10:45, okay, I won't rush it then, okay. So here's some other important factors in consideration and review of an NRT proposal. So obviously the first one, is this a good fit for the NRT program? And just by reviewing the website that I mentioned, the solicitation, and looking at some of those abstracts of prior funded NRTs, you should get a pretty good sense of whether there's a good fit for the program. Stipends, there's a requirement about the stipends, the stipend level. So just make sure that you're meeting the requirement for the stipends level. And at this point, we don't have flexibility on that minimum of $34,000 for a trainee in a 12-month period that need not be 12 consecutive months. The next, I think I already mentioned, a timeline of logically phased training elements over the degree program that may differ for PhDs and masters. So if you have this, if you're going to include both masters and PhD candidates, and you don't describe how the training plan will differ from the masters and the trainee, the PhD trainees, reviewers may say, I don't understand, like how could a master's student possibly do this in 2 years? Or isn't this kind of not fully taking advantage of the potential for a doctoral student to weave in some of these experiences into their doctoral thesis? So showing how these might differ for the two degree types. Making sure that with respect to the professional development themes of communications, team science, and ethics, that there are concrete competencies, rubrics for measuring success. Just a personal thought on this, I think we see a lot of evaluation plans that are only subjective, so they're only student perceptions. Well, do you feel that was a good experience? Do you feel like you learned something from that? That's not really ultimately very valuable. And it's hard to assess behavioral change. And it's hard to assess more concrete acquisition of competencies, but to the extent that you can sort of tap into maybe some existing validated measures to assess those, that would be encouraged. I mentioned the quantitative demographic data. Here it is: recruitment, retention, and time to degree outcomes of students from participating departments. And then in addition to the standard PAP NSF requirement for a statement about any prior NSF support, would be prior experience of the core team members in terms of graduate training, for the PI rather, and the co-PI in terms of graduate training. So you want to have an explicit statement of PI and co-PI experiences in graduate training. Okay, so next, just some common reasons that some proposals may be returned without review, and we hate to return proposals without review. It's becoming easier for proposals not to have to get to this stage because we've now moved to research.gov, and research.gov has some built-in compliance checks before you even submit the proposal that Fastlane did not have. So, but the three that I will mention that come up again and again every cycle, one is missing an institutional letter of support. So you need a letter from a senior university administrator that demonstrates support for this project. And this is one of the first places reviewers will look: is there support? Is there potential for sustainability? Is this being done not under the radar, but actually in full dialogue with the senior leaders of the university? The next one is, I mentioned this core table. The very first thing that we see in an NRT proposal is a table with up to and no more than 10 individuals that include the PI, co-PIs, and other core senior faculty, core faculty members. If this table includes 3 more people or 1 more person, the whole proposal goes back. So you really want to be very, very to the letter on that core table. And then we're pretty careful to make sure every required section is there. Occasionally, somebody may name a section differently than what we ask them to name it. If the content's there, we'll review it. We'll say, okay, maybe this may be fine. Don't take the risk. Just name the sections, what we ask you to name the sections, put them in the order that we ask you to put them in, and it makes the compliance check much easier on us. So we do have a sort of checklist in the solicitation, so you can just use the checklist. So that's what I want to say about the NRT. I know it's sort of very much in the weeds, but I hope what's most inspirational about the NRT is this is This is cutting edge graduate education that's bringing graduate students to focus on the biggest, thorniest societal challenges and sort of I guess, to date, insuperable challenges, including things like climate mitigation, including things like equity across multiple societal systems. So the inspiration should be, what does our institution, what unique advantage does our institution have to work with communities, to work with other educational institutions, to work with the employment sector in some unique way, to bring disciplines together to help solve these challenges in ways that will have ramifications across the nation. So next, I want to move to the Innovations in Graduate Education program. I'm sorry, I think this slide should have a title, but the title's up. But I'm moving now to the IGE program, and I'll just talk briefly about this program. This is the link to the solicitation, which is NSF 20-595. This will see all the requirements for the IGE program. Unlike the NSF, the NRT program, this one doesn't focus on comprehensive traineeship for graduate students. This focus is really on very localized test bed projects that will test in the terms of generating knowledge, generating research, the viability of an intervention or a set of interventions. And predominantly, these have focused on professional development. It began as a track within the NRT, the IGE program. It's now evolved into its own separate program. And so, well, a lot of the IGEs, when you look at what has been funded to date, a lot of these have focused on professional development strategies to help reinforce what we're supporting through the NRTs. We're going beyond that, as you'll see in the example that I'll show. It's really testing any innovations in graduate education, generating knowledge, and doing so with some real research, educational researchers involved in this, or people thinking about how can we ask these questions in the form of educational research questions. Sometimes this is just evaluator, you're evaluating a practice. And those are viable IGE programs, but every IGE proposal should have clear research question or questions, a clear hypothesis, and a very clear statement of the research methods that will be used to answer these questions. So we anticipate somewhere between 6 to 10 awards. This says FY22, but the same number goes for FY23. And proposals are coming up, so that the deadline for this is March 25th, 2023. However, unlike the NRT, which is quite elaborate and really requires multiple months of sustained collaborations and negotiations and discussions, this one's viable. You could potentially shape something between today and March 25th and really come in with a very successful IGE proposal. So really do encourage you to think about this. The awards are between $300,000 and $500,000 for every IGE. The goals of the program are to pilot, test, and validate innovative approaches to graduate education and to generate knowledge required to customize, implement, and encourage broader adoption of these approaches. I think we'll hear from my former colleague, Julia Kent, about an investment that we made in the Council of Graduate Schools to develop a hub, what we call an innovation acceleration hub, which is really to take everything that NSF has funded through this program and figure out how can we accelerate the transition from the knowledge generation that NSF is funding to this broader adoption, implementation, and adaptation of the successful innovations. So we're not asking you to actually demonstrate the adoption, demonstrate the replication, but we're asking you to focus on knowledge in such a way that this is potentially replicable, scalable. Okay, so I guess this program is informed by some of the strategic frameworks for NSF investments in graduate education, and those include advancing science and engineering research, broadening participation to promote excellence in research, and building the next generation STEM workforce, and building effective models of graduate education and workforce development. For some reason, this is not legible, but yeah, I think the purple here is professional development. So the point of the additional parts of the pie is that we are expanding the areas of focus. And just one example I'll show you. This was led by Principal Investigator Julie Pacelli. And this project focused on equity in graduate education. And they developed a consortium that enabled universities within the California system and increasingly beyond the California system to come together to identify and create a community around best practices in admissions, retention, recruitment, building infrastructure for faculty development specific to equity concerns among graduate students. So it's a whole range of very systemic practices that will bring the graduate school faculty and graduate students together to address equity in a systemic, holistic fashion. And so we're thrilled to have been a part of funding this project and to see that it's now scaling up into a sustainable network that's resulting in tangible changes across graduate education. So this is not just the NRT team, this is also the IGE team. Some of my colleagues who you'll have a chance to speak to today, Vinod Lahani, Francis Mary Meduno, and then we have just a wonderful set of colleagues who I'm not sure are with us online yet today, but expect to pop in and out over the next couple of days. And so, but please, if you have any interest in unanswered questions in either the NRT program or the IGE program after this workshop concludes tomorrow, we're always open to answer those questions. And please reach out to me, Vinod, or to Francis Mary, and we'll be happy to be in dialogue with you. So with that, I'll just thank you for your time and interest in these programs, and happy to answer any questions if there are. The first question is it okay if the institutional support letter comes from the Vice Provost of Research? That is absolutely fine for that letter to come from the VPR. Sometimes the VPR is also the head of the graduate education, but to know that there's strong institutional support from the head of research is terrific, because then they know that this isn't one PI working in isolation, but that there's actually support for that convergence. Yes, there's a question.
Yes, I was listening to you about evaluations. Do you all prefer that the evaluations are open-ended questions instead of survey Likert scale questions?
There's no preference. We don't get into that level of granular. Pardon me? Oh, yes, repeat the question. The question was, is there a preference or a requirement for either program that the evaluation include open-ended questions versus Likert or maybe more quantifiable responses? So neither program has any strictures or any limitations regarding the methodologies, the particular methodologies used. The only thing that you want to keep in mind with respect to qualitative versus quantitative methods of evaluation is that if you have a very small sample size, highly quantitative methodologies may not be the best, most appropriate, might not yield the most appropriate and valuable information. So it's not to say you shouldn't have quantitative, but sometimes you may see reviewers say that they're bringing in big guns in terms of highly complex quantitative methodologies, but they only have 15 students in the sample. So just make sure that the whoever's helping to shape that methodology is aware, what is the sample size, or what's the participant size, and yeah, they'll be able to help you make those decisions appropriate to the project.
And as you were coming to the principles, you broke them down and provided questions that may be asked under those categories. I was wondering if we were able to get a copy of this PowerPoint.
Absolutely.
To have as a reference.
Absolutely, yeah. A copy will be made available, and hopefully the organizers can send a copy or make it available to every participant.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Mark?
Yes, so in the NRT, the core 10 individuals, if we have someone in like the graduate school who runs professional development workshops, would that be one of those individuals, or is that somebody that's separate?
So that's it's your call to identify, do you want to use up that space for somebody who might be providing more of a programmatic role and less of a research role? Sometimes that's absolutely appropriate. Sometimes you'll want to make sure that you use that 10 core slots for everybody that you think will represent the big guns, as it were, the powerhouse team of both the intellectual and the educational, goals of the program. So it's hard to sort of give you advice in terms of the generality of that. I would say just make sure you use those 10 spaces wisely. You can always name other faculty, and you can always name other people who are helping you at the programmatic level. But I think we do say that an evaluator must be named among those 10. Yes.
Good morning. I have a question about the broadening participation and the diversity piece. Could you give some examples of diversity outside of those things that are readily identifiable? We generally think about race, we generally think about gender, and at an HBCU, we do have opportunities to recruit non-Black students, but how would we address, what are some other dimensions of diversity that we might consider as we are talking about broadening participation?
That's a really good question. So the question is, what other metrics or what other ways of thinking about diversity would be appropriate to the NRT? And I think it's sort of like when we're encouraging people to make the case that something is a national priority. I think similarly, contextually, diversity may mean something very different in an engineering program than in a bio engineering program or environmental science program. So gender diversity be very different in engineering than in an environmental science program. So we're also open to thinking about gender in ways that go beyond binary male female. I would also say think about neurodiversity. There's a huge discourse now about how do we engage more neurodiverse graduate students in graduate education, and we've funded some really fabulous projects both through NRT and IGE on neurodiversity. So I have to say the metrics that we're asking for in terms of data, they really get to that race and ethnicity and gender, and those will ultimately be important. But it's very important, for you to be thinking about what does diversity mean for our context, and how do we want to use this project to reach students that are underrepresented in the programs in graduate education or STEM workforce at large. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but then how you shape, and I want to know if it does, but how you shape your partnerships within your campus and outside your campus would reflect how you're defining your diversity goals.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I had a follow-up to that just as a point of clarification, because when NSF talks about broadening participation, it's talking about it at the national level or the disciplinary level, is my understanding, correct? So for an HBCU or an MSI, there isn't a burden to increase the number, the degree of diversity within the program by admitting white students? Is that?
Well, when we start talking about broadening participation, particularly for graduate students, and you're focused on an HBCU, we are more likely to attract non-Black students at the graduate level, depending on what the degree area is. But in an instant where you are unable to do that, but there are underrepresented groups. So for example, you may have, because most of the people, at least for in my program, are not full-time. They may be professionals who are coming back to get a master's degree to increase their professional development or opportunities for promotion, or maybe even to change a discipline. And so would you think of broadening participation in that way, which may be gender, could be race, it could be even age related. So you're focused on more older, more mature students versus the typical maybe young master's student that's fresh out of undergraduate. You understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
just trying to wrap my mind around what this diversity spectrum would look like and linking it to broadening participation.
And so one of the things that we ask you to do in the broadening participation strategy is to make reference to national data.
Okay.
So if you have a set of disciplines you're bringing together, and you can get national data, not just maybe on gender and race and ethnicity, but also about returning adults from the workforce, people transitioning back to graduate education, and now if there's data that you can kind of anchor your argument around, that this isn't just us thinking in isolation of the program and the institution, but we're also thinking more broadly, that will enhance the argument for the diversity strategy that you're laying out. But it's ultimately, it's up to you to lay out, this is our diversity strategy, and this is why we're pursuing it, the way we are. I see a long question in the chat. Could you explain the reasoning? I'm reading it before I know if I can answer this or not. So could you explain the reasoning historically from NSF NRT program to only fund one 12-month period per student? Does an average 18 to 25 students per funded NRT mean the institution has 25 external project funds those students after 12 months? Are those students still considered to be NRT students? Okay, there's several questions to break down here. The first is the NRT does not prevent programs from having students receive funding for 2 years. So you could have 2 years of funding for a trainee, and beyond the 34,000 for a 12-month period, it can be more flexible. It's the 12 months at 34,000. That's what the requirement is. So you could certainly have 2 years of funding. Another question is, do we consider funded NRTs trainees, those trainees for the life of their program? Or are they really funded NRTs only during the time of their funding? And if I'm understanding the question correctly, they are trainees for life, but certainly during the time of their whole graduate program. The funding just comes in and then it goes away. And for some institutions, they're able to keep that level of support consistent. For other institutions, this will be a bump in their funding and then they will come back. Or they will supplement the funding with some other mechanism. So, but the main point is that, both the funded trainees and then there are non-funded trainees, they're all considered NRT trainees during the time of their graduate program. And yes, institutions may have to figure out how do we make the inequity between the funded NRTs and the non-funded NRTs less, less staunch, less stark. And how can we create those create that sense of NRT cohort identity that includes both the funded and the non-funded NRT trainees. So yes, if you're going to fund trainees for 2 years, you may have a number that's less than the average that I was citing. and Sandra, and then I think we have one more question.
Two questions that came up when we started to write the NRT. It was back to that core table that Mark mentioned. And one, should the graduate dean be the leader of the NRT? Should be PI. Okay, that's the question. And how many NRTs can be submitted per university? We had 2 different PIs were interested in, so this is a transformational grant.
Yeah.
Should, with our graduate population, should it just be 1 NRT? Or could it be 2? And should the graduate dean be the PI?
Okay, great question, Sandra. So, the easy one is that there is a limitation, a limit of 2 proposals per institution
Okay.
per cycle, right? So per annual cycle. You definitely want to make sure everybody who's working on an NRT is in dialogue with the institution so that there are no surprises. Oh, wait, somebody's just spent 3 months working on a proposal. So most institutions have an internal review deadline. For everybody working on an NRT, there's an internal review deadline, then the institution will pick which 2 will go forward. Okay, so the second question, should the graduate dean be PI? So, yeah, so here, I would say most likely the graduate dean is not the PI. However, there have been cases where the research being conducted, especially with IGE programs, so IGE is a little different, but it's being conducted in such a way that the graduate school or the graduate dean's research area is so pivotal that there's a case to be made for this. So we wouldn't say don't, graduate dean should not be PI, because most graduate deans have research. They might have research labs that have greater or lesser degrees of activity. But in terms of an NRT, what you really want for the PI is a strong researcher in one of the core research domains that's coming together under convergence. So for IGE, it's very, very plausible that a strong proposal would have a graduate dean as PI, as long as the research is coming through. It's not just an action project. Yes.
Okay, so another question. I know the NRT and I know that they focus on STEM. I'm just wondering for participants in the program, so when you start talking about the cross-disciplinary approach that you're looking for, I'm just trying to see how do we integrate so that all of the participants are clear about what they get from it. Because when you start going to teams, people want to know, well, what am I going to get from it? What is my program going to get from it? What are my students going to get? And I'm wondering, so if a student is, well, I guess the science is broad, the definition for science technology. And it depends on the definition you're using. It will determine which program or which set of students. So for example, our program is public policy and public administration.
Yeah.
So when you look at the definition for public administration, it is considered a science by itself because it looks at behavior of individuals and organizations. But if you look at public policy, it may say that it is not a science. But we do know that there is, depending on the definition, there is implementation science as a part of the public policy piece. So I'm just trying to figure out how do we make, when we're working, we have a team of people we work at, I understand, but as we go back and we began looking at students who we select, broadening participation. So I'm going through all of that to get to my question. So broadening participation, if we were going to move outside of a traditional STEM that would be in biology and climate change and all of that, but we move to the social sciences, would that be considered broadening participation? Or would the broadening participation be geared mainly toward participation in the natural sciences? I'll say it that way, and versus the social science.
So
Does that make sense?
let me repeat back to what one version of the question that I'm hearing, which is you're shaping an NRT proposal.
Mhm,
Every NRT has both NRT funded trainees
mhm.
and non-NRT funded trainees. You're trying to figure out who should get the funding.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because the reality is, when you're talking about collaboration, whether it's community-based or university, everybody is wanting to know what's in it for me.
Right.
And so I'm trying to wrap my mind around
Yeah.
how do we frame this?
Yeah.
And if there is a possibility that maybe they benefit from being a non-funded.
Yes, yeah. So this is a great question. And you're already onto the answer that I would provide, but you'll hear from other voices today. But I would say the GRFP appendix links to NSF definitions of STEM. It provides it spells out every single subfield that NSF defines as STEM. And it's very, as you just mentioned, it's very broad, it's very inclusive of multiple social sciences, of history of science, of all kinds of things. So look at that with respect to who are we going to fund. But you already sort of answered your own question. Then your challenge might be, okay, of those that really aren't eligible for NRT funding, how do we create incentives for them to recognize that there's a real benefit for their participation as non-funded NRTs? And there are all kinds of, there are some small monetary incentives, but there are opportunities to link them up to internship, experiences, experiential learning experiences, to position them as experts in dialogue on disciplines. So you'll hear a variety of mechanisms. You'll see them when you look at the abstracts. But I think NRTs are struggling with exactly that, but there are some really good ideas to do that, and hopefully others.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for great questions. Any questions that have not been answered, we'll try to answer them offline. Did we miss yours?
It was just a quick question.
I can answer a quick question.
Yeah, I was wondering, is the grant renewable? Like if you get the grant after 5 years or after the 3 years, can you get another one?
The grant, no, NRTs are not renewable. Yeah, so keep that in mind. In fact, many NRT recipients have a hard time spending money in 5 years. And or with COVID, of course, needed really an extra year, extra 2 years to try to complete an extra year.
So you can get an extension.
You can get one extension. And the reason why you can't get two is that there are federal limits about federal funding. So if the grant comes as a standard grant, which is one lump sum at the beginning, then you can't get a second year extension. You only get 1 year extension.
Okay.
Okay, but we could talk offline about that. But thank you very much for the questions. And again, Vinod, Lohani, Francis Marie, will be happy to answer any questions that weren't answered.